Hey, still remember that one time this French guy was so obsessed by painting the same church over and over again? Well, his name was Claude Monet, and starting in 1892 he painted the Cathedral of Rouen no less than 30 times. And he almost never changed the perspective. Because what he really wanted to capture was the lighting, color mood and texture that changed with different daytimes and seasons. Now you might ask, could I do something similar in a piece of music? Well, to find out, we'll have to make use of a real musical superpower called reharmonization. Okay. Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. Today I want to talk to you about one of my favorite topics, which is harmony. Specifically, reharmonization in practice. And I say in practice because there are already some great videos out there that cover the topic of reharmonization, going in discrete steps from basic triads to more advanced chord types, and then through the most complex 12-tone upper structure reharmonizations that you can imagine. And don't get me wrong, writing these exercises really can be fun and teach you a lot. But today I will take a different approach and show you the subtle use of reharmonization in the course of a longer piece of music. After covering the basics, I will show you an orchestral example where I use the same theme no less than 14 times in the same piece. Now, what actually is reharmonization? Basically, it means that you take an existing melody and replace its original chords. This concept is used quite heavily in jazz, but it was already known in classical music. And even today it is used quite a lot in film music, and that for a good reason. Not only can you change and shade the emotions that are expressed by a melody, but for longer forms like films, reharmonization also helps you to develop a theme and keep the music coherent on the surface, while still reflecting the emotional state of the protagonists that changes over time in a longer narrative. Now you also might ask, how do I actually reharmonize a theme? For this, let me briefly show you the basic process of it with a simple melody in C major that I will play for you on the piano. Let's say we want to reharmonize the first chord, which is C major. There are already 5 other triads that could go together with the C in the melody. For example, F major, where C is the 5th. Or A minor, where C is the 3rd. Let's hear the melody together with this A minor at the beginning. Already pretty different, huh? The only thing we had to do was to redefine the function that the melody note had in a chord. And if we want to go beyond the original C major scale, we could use the melody C with an A flat major chord. You also can use inversions or any other chord. Also try to consider your melody notes not only as inherent part of the chords, but also as dissonant added tensions. For example, the C could be the second in a B flat minor chord. If you have 2 or more melody notes for one chord, then you have to make some compromises. You could try to find a chord that contains both notes, but you also could harmonize each note with its own chord and speed up the harmonic rhythm of your piece. Finally, you also could change the melody a little bit in order to match the harmonic content. Now let's come to our main example. As I already mentioned, reharmonization really helps you to write longer structures that stay interesting without inventing new thematic material every time. As an example for this, we'll now have a look at the piece Bogo's Head. I wrote it for solo cello and string orchestra, plus some additional instruments like accordion and celesta. At first, let's have a listen to the beginning of the piece in order to get an impression how it works. In this piece, I wanted to portray a fictional person that is kind and nostalgic, but also a little bit eccentric and stubborn. Like the solo cello's main theme that repeats over and over again, this person might have a precious memory that keeps coming back to his mind, but every time in a slightly different shading. The main theme is 4 bars long, and I will also analyze the piece together with you in these 4-bar blocks. After a short introduction, which establishes D minor as the tonic, the solo cello enters. Pretty soon we leave the somber D minor, and a short cadence leads us from C to F major, which is the relative major of our home key. This opening gesture supports the rising cello line and brightens up the emotional color of the music. And when the cello finally hits the high note C, I could have harmonized it again with F major, but I decided to do something more interesting in this case. This B flat major makes the C in the melody a ninth, and for me this major at 9 chord really has an interesting and almost glowing color. Every time I try to come up with new themes, I look for these special notes and interesting harmonies because they really add character, and I also avoid repeating them in order to keep these moments singular and special. Now let's come to the second block, which is the first reharmonization of our main theme. You might have noticed I left the first 2 bars unchanged, but I replaced the F major chord with an A sus4 chord that resolves to A major in the 4th bar. The ending on A major, which is the 5 chord in D minor, produces a half cadence that functions as kind of a question mark, and that also keeps up the tension in the piece. The melody avoids the last note C in order not to clash with the C sharp in the A major chord. Now to the third block. This one is almost exactly the same as our original theme, but this time I reharmonized the C in the melody with an A minor triad. This might seem a little ordinary, but this actually prepares us for the next chord that opens up the 4th block. This lush B flat major 7th chord finally reharmonizes the D minor that opened up every block so far. Going down to a chord that lies a third below the original one is a simple but one of the most effective ways to reharmonize a melody. You also could go down a 5th or even a 7th. In this case, your melody notes more and more become upper extensions of the chords. This intensifies your theme, but it also opens your piece up to new harmonic possibilities. Your audience will much more appreciate these simple reharmonizations if you don't hit them with crazy chords right from the beginning. Although I'm a big fan of complex harmonies, my advice here is keep your best ideas for later. Now let's hear the whole 4th block. A short Aeolian cadence leads us back to our home key D. But when we finally get there, I use a suspended 4th in order not to resolve too early and keep the piece flowing. The melody is also varied quite a bit in order to come back to the root note D. Then the last chord, A minor, has the function of a dominant that creates momentum for the next section of the piece. Before we go on to this next part, let's summarize what we've got so far. Maybe you've already noticed it, but the main theme combined with its 3 reharmonizations actually forms a bigger 16-bar period form. We started with an opening gesture that brightened up from D minor to its relative major. The second block contrasted with a half cadence in order to keep up the tension. Then the opening statement came again in a slightly varied form, and then we hit a climax, and a short cadence led us back to the 1 chord. This forms the A section of the piece. It is followed by a variation called A2. The overall form of the piece can be described as A, A2, a modulating B section, then A2 again, and A3, another variation at the end. Now let's hear the second part, A2. You can hear that the melody in the cello stays exactly the same like in the A section, but around it other instruments are introduced, for example the violins and the accordion. Harmonically, the first two blocks also stay the same like in the A section, but in the third and fourth block we get a completely new reharmonization of our theme. We start with B flat major and then go down to G minor with an added sixth. In our key, G minor is the 4 chord and wasn't heard so far in the piece. This adds a new and slightly darker color to our palette. Right after this, the bass notes start to descend stepwise for 4 bars. In musicology, this figure is called lament bass and is typically associated with mourning and sadness. This, combined with the psi motive in the violins, creates a feeling of desperation. And right in the moment when the cadence could lead us back to our home chord D minor, we modulate to an unexpected B minor. This deceptive cadence is a small surprise and creates a completely new color that steps outside of the original D minor. It also prepares us for the following B part, which contains some weirder chord changes and also illustrates more of the eccentric side of our protagonist. Because the B section doesn't contain the main theme at all, we will now skip it and go on to the recapitulation of the A2 section. In this fourth part of the piece, we hear the same harmonies as in the second one, but this time the roles of the soloist and the orchestra are inverted. Now the violins play the melody in a high register and the solo cello answers with contrapunctual interludes. Switching the roles of melody and accompaniment is an old orchestration trick, but it gets me every time. And I think it's so successful because it fulfills two functions at the same time. It gives you a fresh and new texture, but it also sounds familiar. Now we've entered the last part of the piece, where the solo cello plays the main theme 2 more times. And again, we hear a completely new reharmonization of our melody. In the accompaniment, the upper voices almost stand still on the D minor triad. Meanwhile, the bass descends again in steps, mostly chromatic steps, which is another variation of the lament bass. In the fourth bar of the block, we come across this slightly strange chord, which is B flat major with an added sixth and a ninth in the melody. This chord contains 2 guide tones that both lead to the note A. So this whole chord B flat 9 can be seen as a chromatic approach to the dominant chord A major. But in this piece, the A major chord never shows up. Thus, this last section of the piece intentionally gives the feeling of stagnation and unresolved yearning. Let's remember the beginning of the piece, shall we? The first appearance of the theme was an ascending opening gesture that led us to brighter major harmonies. Now, the last reharmonization of the theme with its descending bass line and stagnant middle voices clearly signalizes that this piece is coming to an end. This comparison is a good example how reharmonization can indicate the formal function that a section has. Whether it is an opening part, a developing interlude, or a closing coda really can be defined by the use of reharmonization. Let's hear the beginning of the last section. At this moment, I want to say a big thank you to the soloist of the recording that you heard today. His name is Werner Klemmer, and I think he did an amazing job playing the solo cello. Just read the instructions that I gave him in the solo cello part, and you will realize this is not an easy task for a string player. Thanks again, Werner, for your fantastic interpretation. And now let's summarize the main points of today's tutorial. If you want to reharmonize a melody, just try to find another chord that also contains your melody note. Don't think you have to reharmonize everything with crazy chords. Most of the time, a subtle reharmonization like using a chord a third below works absolutely brilliant. It helps you to shape the mood of your melody, it helps you to develop your themes, and it also creates different formal functions for every section of your piece. Also try to keep the balance of expected and unexpected chords in your music. And finally, if you have great and crazy ideas, don't shoot them off too early. If you want to write captivating and great music that keeps growing on, save your best ideas for later. That's it for the video today. I hope you enjoyed it, and just let me say I was absolutely surprised by the number of views and subscribers for my first tutorial. Thanks a lot for all the kind words you left in the comments. I really appreciate them. And I will do my very best to keep the videos on this channel entertaining and informative for everybody who wants to learn something about music. And again, if you like the piece Bogo's Head, you can hear it on my orchestral album Awakenings, which will come out in just a few days. Thanks again for joining me. Keep making good music. Bye bye.